Narcissistic love is easy to write. Indeed, it's all we ever do. One Hallmark card at a time, and often over a glass of wine, preferably one that's been decanted, leaving the sediment elsewhere. But how to write those real love letters I mentioned, those letters of love addressed elsewhere, which also populate the analytic discourse. With S1s, S2s, abject little a's, and slashed s's, you reply. And a certain delta as well, McCormick, you add, because you've been tuning into these lectures on Lacan. And don't forget those vectors as well. You know the vectors I'm talking about, the ones that allow us to connect those little love letters into something that is a matheme. Here, as I draw on the blackboard, once more, the matheme that is the analytic discourse. It is a matheme, and there are all the pieces. Letters that aren't really letters, vectors that are more like paths, and a delta, which is an impotentiality raised to the level of an impossibility, for better and for worse in Lacan's thought. Because as you've heard me say numerous times, when he raises impotentiality to the level of an impossibility in his report on Seminar 19B or worse, it's a slip. It's a slip because now he has overwritten impotentiality, and the modality of the potential slips accordingly out of his thought. And that, I think, is a dilemma, one that deserves correction and one in whose direction we are working. In Chapter 6 of Seminar 21, this matheme for Lacan is no longer sufficient. He wants to add some additional writings to bring us a little closer to these letters of love, these little piles of letters comprised of little piles of strokes. You see the theme of abjection once again? In Chapter 6 of Seminar 21, he's going to be adding to this with a couple more writings. I'd say 3. Oh, but if we start looking at it in terms of piles, I don't even know what the count is going to be. To start and to put us on this path in Seminar 21, recall the passage I read to you from Chapter 6, page 109 in particular, where Lacan claims that in the Borromean knot that makes 3 of the real, symbolic, and imaginary, it's the real that is at stake. Why is the real 3? Lacan asks there. It is a question that I ground, he says, that I justify from the fact that there is no sexual relationship. Just think about this for a minute. If there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, and there cannot ever be such a thing as the sexual relationship, then the sexual relationship cannot be written. This is why, once more, Lacan defines the impossible as that which does not stop not writing itself. You see, narcissistic love never stops writing itself, one Hallmark card right after the other. But the sexual rapport it promises, that motherfucker never stops not writing itself. Which is why these Hallmark cards always come up short. Let me be clear about this. Oneness never shows up, even and especially when we imagine otherwise. But here's the catch. We can say all of this about the sexual relationship, which is no such thing, just as I'm doing right now. And we can write it too, just as Lacan wants to show us in Chapter 6 of Seminar 21. If the question of the real 3 is grounded in the sexual non-rapport, where and how do we ground this sexual non-rapport? Why, in a certain written formulation, of course. Join me on page 109. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of this certain written mathematical, of course, formulation. I'm on page 109 of this packet, this unofficial English translation of Seminar 21 that we've been working with. I like how literal the damn thing is, but anyway, here it is on page 109. Note the shift towards written formulae. It's a question, you just heard me recall from Lacan, that I ground, that I justify from the fact that there is no sexual relationship. The passage in question at this point continues directly from the one we just reviewed. In other words, that I specify from something that can be written, as a result of which what is written is that, for example, there does not exist an F such that between X and Y, which here signify the foundation of such and such speaking beings, to be chosen from the male or the female part, this function which would constitute the relationship, this function of the man with respect to the woman, this function of the woman with respect to the man, there does not exist one that can be written. And then he continues and repeats it. There is no function that links them. Pay close attention here. Because there is no function which would constitute a sexual relation between them two sexes, this function which is no such thing, cannot be written. But here's that hook again. Even though this function cannot be written, the impossibility of writing this function can. The impossibility of writing this function which does not exist can indeed be written. We can formulate its non-existence. This is the hook. Lacan seems to want to do so in words, but note also his variables here. There does not exist an F such that between X and Y, we can write a formula for their relationship, especially when it's a sexual relationship we're after. Because there is no function that links them, we cannot write such a function. It's really as simple as that. We can, however, formulate the non-existence of such a function. And there again is our hook. The there does not exist, as Lacan puts it, can indeed be written. And not just in words like these, but in mathematical symbols as well. And we got the blackboard up in front of us, so let's give it a try. If the there does not exist can be written, and not just in words, but in mathematical symbols, allowing us to arrive at a written mathematical formula, let's give it a try. Lacan, in these chapters, mentions that quantifier of existence. You've seen it before. Don't trip up about this. There's really nothing new here about the quantifier of existence that he's messing with. The quantifier of existence is simply E that's backwards with an X next to it. It looks like a capital E backwards with a little X next to it. Now what you know, because you've been tuning in, is that that is not an E. And that X is not an X at all. This is the quantifier of existence that can be read out of mathematical symbology as saying there exists something, someone, something. EX, perhaps, but really nothing of the sort. Now, what we're dealing with here is non-existence. There does not exist a formula that could connect the two, link them in a sexual rapport resulting in one. How do we write the quantifier of non-existence? Well, think back to what Lacan was doing with feminine sexuation. Add a bar above the backwards capital EX next to X looking motherfucker. This negates whatever comes underneath it. The bar across the top negates. So now instead of reading there exists something, now we see there does not exist something. The next move here is exactly the one that X begs of us. Solve for it. Solve for me, the X requests. When we solve for X, what we're solving for is a function that doesn't exist. Specifically, the non-existence of a function that would allow them two sexes, or at least two sexed members of these groups, to fuse together into one. So how best to write this solution for the variable X? The function in question Lacan specifies, I think just a page later than the one we were reading, is a little kind of slightly italicized extra lovely f for function next to the parens x, comma, y. This is the function which is no such thing that would integrate 1 and 1 into 1. The function in question is written just as you see it on the blackboard here. Now, if we're going to say that this function doesn't exist, and we're going to say that this function here is a solution for the x in the quantifier of non-existence, you now know how to write the formula. The way we write this formula is as follows. There does not exist a function that would allow masculine and feminine subjects to merge into one. And I put the line across the entire thing so you can see it. There does not exist a function such that x and y become one. Here is a new formula. You may have seen a bit of this from that backwards E, the quantifier of existence, and the bar that negates it above. But what we're adding here is that function, which is no such thing. Take a close look at this written formula. Indeed, give it a second glance. What do you see before you? Clearly, these ain't words. But nor, I repeat, nor are they letters, at least in the alphabetic sense. And zoom out from this formula. Look at the symbols we used to build it. Look at the matheme of the analytic discourse above it. What do you see here? There's not a word on your screen, but I'm telling you, nor is there a letter on your screen. Not in the alphabetic sense. What you see instead is a little pile of little piles. You see, in the formula we just wrote, that is not a capital E. That is not an F. That is not an X, and that is not a Y. So what, I wonder, kind of letters are these little things? They are, once more, love letters. Real love letters. Little piles of non-alphabetic, mathematized letters which show what there is between masculine and feminine subjects, namely an impossibility relative to the sexual relationship that touches on the real. Here, my friends, is that irremediable division Lacan presents at the end of chapter 6. Here, my friends, is that wall. Note how Lacan unfolds and unfurls all of this. An irremediable division, distinction, or difference he further specifies, between what he calls two knowledges, both of which are unconscious, allowing for two half-sayings which do not overlap, much less fuse into one. We'll come to the exact passage in a minute, but I want your attention to be on it already. With these additions, things start to become clear. With each addition, I'm going to argue, we come one step closer to the other love Lacan has in mind at this point in Seminar 21. A love, I told you, that isn't fixated on images of oneness, but ecstatic, if I can put it that way, about the fact that love's real count is 3 instead. Ecstatic to the point of love's reflowering, of love's flowering anew. We don't have a name for this kind of love in Lacanian psychoanalysis. We talked a lot about it, but we don't have a name for this love. Here in Seminar 21, though, Lacan comes pretty close to giving us a name for this kind of love, this other love. He calls it, and don't think it's going to be fabulous, because what he calls it is simply good love. Page 119 is the one in question. It's the one I was queuing up just a minute ago. It's the one that I told you we're working toward. It's the one whose first part you've heard before, but now we are poised to read the whole thing. I love this passage on page 119, toward the end of chapter 6, the 6th lesson in Seminar 21. And it begins with that name for this other love that maybe we could do better with. Good love, Lacan calls it. Good love, I will say then, since you will excuse me that this plagues me, love is the truth, but only insofar as it is starting from it, starting from a cut, that there begins a different knowledge than propositional knowledge, namely unconscious knowledge. It is the truth insofar as it cannot be said about the subject, insofar as what is supposed to be able to be known about the sexual partner. And here's the key phrase. Love is two half-sayings that do not overlap. And this is what gives it its fatal character. It is the irremediable division. I mean, why it cannot be remedied, which implies that the medium or the mediation might already be possible. And precisely, it is not only irremediable, but without any mediation. It is the connectiveness between two knowledges insofar as they are irremediably distinct. When that happens, it creates something quite privileged. I gotta admit, not since Seminar 17 have I encountered such an outstanding definition of true love, because it's on the verge of real love in Lacan's thought. And you know the passage in Seminar 17 that I have in mind. It's the one I've been reading for a while now to anyone who will listen. The love of truth is the love of this weakness whose veil we have lifted. It's the love of what truth hides, which is called castration. That there is a love of weakness, Lacan continues, is no doubt the essence of love. As I have said, love is giving what one doesn't have. namely, what might make good this original weakness. Straight from Seminar 17, page 52 of the Standard English Translation. It's one of the best pages in that seminar, that famous seminar. I just love what's happening there on page 52 of the English, and that's what I'm reading from. Make no mistake, though, in hearing this passage from Seminar 17. There and here at this point in Seminar 21, in the paragraph you heard me read about love being two half-sayings that do not overlap, good love, privileged love being two half-sayings that do not overlap, we are no longer talking about narcissistic love here. Even though it's only by way of narcissistic love, notably via its failures, that we've now finally arrived at this other love, this good love, this love which is indeed quite privileged. It's by way of narcissistic love that we arrive at good love, privileged love, love that is two half-sayings that do not overlap among lovers who would never wish it otherwise. Why am I messing around with this? Why am I dipping all the way back into Seminar 17 to bring forward some insights about what I perceive to be a profound strand of love theory in Lacan's work? Why recall it here and now? Because when Lacan says that love is two half-sayings that do not overlap in Seminar 21, I think he is doubling down on the love of weakness, which is fundamentally the love of castration that he cues up in Seminar 17. He is doubling down on the love of castration when he theorizes good love as two half-sayings that do not overlap on page 119 of Seminar 21. Now that's a lot. It's a wager, but I also think it's correct. And for this double down of a love of castration, for this love of castration to become the essence of good love, the basis for a privileged love, I got news for you, news that you've heard from me before. We gonna need a new modality for that shit. The modality of castration that we love is neither contingency nor possibility, necessity nor even impossibility. Instead, the modality that attends the love of weakness, which is fundamentally the love of castration, which is fundamentally the good love that Lacan is discussing here, where two half-sayings do not overlap, the modality that attends this through line is impotentiality, which is in turn the flip side, the sibling, the twin, the Siamese twin even, the conjoined twin of the potential. What do I mean by impotentiality? You've probably heard me discuss it elsewhere. I mean the same thing that we've been talking about from Aristotle to Agamben on impotentiality. Impotentiality means not being able to say or do something, but also far more precisely and far more profoundly to be capable of an incapacity. And that's the secret here. Impotentiality has less to do with not being able to do something, hence impotence. It has more to do with being capable of an incapacity. That's what impotentiality is about. It's about being able to endure inability. What else does it mean to love weakness? To love weakness, even in its most intractable form, aka castration, is to love a certain incapacity, inability, a certain not being able. And crucially, to cultivate a certain potentiality relative to this state. Specifically, hear me now, an ability to endure and even enjoy this incapacity. If love is two half sayings that do not overlap, those who experience it are doubly constrained, doubly limited, doubly incapacitated, doubly in love with castration. You see, my love for you originates in a field of unconscious knowledge that is mostly unknowable to me, and thus only ever able to be half said. I just can't say it all, my love. And my limited saying is addressed to you across an unspannable gap, an irremediable division that you and I both are powerless to close. And guess what? The same is true of you, my love. You love me from origins beyond your reach, beyond your ability to say, across chasms that neither of us can close. And we wouldn't have it any other way. When Lacan tells us in Seminar 21 that love is the relationship of the real to knowledge, this is precisely what he means. To love beyond narcissism is to awaken from the dream of oneness with oneself, letting go of the pursuit of autonomy in order to embrace the unconscious instead, a function and field of knowing that proves again and again that we are heteronymous beings, ever divided from ourselves. Here is your truth, mine as well. There's always more to say than we are able. But to love beyond narcissism is also to awaken from the dream of oneness with others, foregoing the fantastical promise of a sexual relationship for an appreciation, even a love, of the non-rapport between us, even and especially when it's love we feel for each other. Here is our point of access to the real, an irremediable division, distinction, or gap between us that ensures your half-sayings and mine do not overlap, as Lacan so well puts it. So let's be categorical here, because the stakes are as high as they've ever been. Where our sayings, and by extension ourselves, do not overlap, we touch upon the real. Or maybe from a slightly different angle. Our truth, which is the truth of castration, touches on the real because it ensures that our sayings and selves alike remain incomplete and non-overlapping. Now, anytime I start queuing up the word self, I start to trip. A little smoke comes out of my ear. It's tough to read Lacan and not have some smoke come out of your ear anytime selfhood comes up. What exactly is the self in all of this? You've just heard me say selves and sayings not overlapping, both being incomplete. What's the self in all of this? We've talked a lot about sayings in the past few lectures. What the fuck is a self? The self here, as I'm using it, is exactly what Lacan has been calling it for decades at this point. The Lacanian self on display here is a barred subject, written like an S with a slash through it, just like the green one you see on your screen right now. And why, again, is the classic Lacanian subject, the neurotic subject, divided in this way? Because the classic Lacanian self is fundamentally a speaking being. Here, in Seminar 21, Lacan wants to further conceptualize the speaking being that makes for split subjectivity by, wait for it, topologizing that shit. And this is the second major writing that is occurring in these middle chapters of Seminar 21. It's a writing that looks a bit more like a drawing because we now pass from mathematical formula to a formulation that's still mathematical but looks a hell of a lot more like a topology. So hang on to your hats because we're about to write some more on this blackboard of ours. If you think about it, this is what Lacan has been up to since the start of Seminar 21, pushing towards a topologization of the speaking being. I quote, "There are 3 dimensions of space inhabited by the speaking being. And these 3 D-mansions, D-I-T mansions, as I write them, are called the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real." It's from page 25 of our packet. Now, you've heard this, symbolic, imaginary, and real, 3 dimensions inhabited by the speaking being. You can imagine the drawing we're about to get into. But let's take it slow. How exactly do these 3 dimensions of speaking being hang together? In a Borromean knot, of course. And what exactly is the Borromean knot for Lacan? Lacanians never seem to tire of drawing this thing, but if you'll note, well, you won't be able to avoid noticing this by the time we're done. If you'll note, 90% of the people do not draw this thing correctly. You think that the Borromean knot can be drawn with 3 strokes, each of which creates a circle. Wrong. It takes 6 strokes, 6 distinct strokes, irremediably divided from themselves and each other, in order to draw a Borromean knot. We're going to see if we can get it done. Maybe not in this lecture, maybe it'll take us this entire series, but we're going to see if we can get it done correctly. What then is this Borromean knot, this linkage of sorts for Lacan? Hear me now. It is an image of 3 interlocking rings defined as a knot and part of a certain material event. A happening is how Lacan calls it in the first half of Seminar 21. A happening, a material event comprised of the drawing of this knot on the board and the discussion of this knot in Lacan's seminar. Now, do you see what I'm doing here? What exactly is the Borromean knot for Lacan? Before we even try and draw this thing, notice how his definition of the Borromean knot is fundamentally imaginary, symbolic, and real. What's the Borromean knot for Lacan? It's an image, imaginary, of 3 interlocking rings, defined, by way of the symbolic, as a knot, and part of a certain material event, a happening, comprised of its real drawing on the board and its real discussion in Lacan's seminar. And here I'm using real a bit naively to get at what he calls elsewhere in these pages, real presence. Real presence on the board. Sounds, those sounds. If you've ever had a chalkboard where somebody writes on it, Lord have mercy, those sounds. I remember in one of my first jobs as a professor, they had me in a big lecture hall. Mathematics department was kind enough to let me use this thing. And I so loved this lecture hall. Not just because you could see 150, 200 students right up the wall. It was like they sat in a stadium. But because the chalkboard was one of 6 or 7 And with a button, I could fill one and then raise it up. And then there was another right behind it. And then I could raise those two up. I don't think I ever got there, but my goal was to get all 6 chalkboards completely filled with scribblings and scrabblings and scratchings of every sort for the group. I think I got to 5. I think I got 5 of those chalkboards filled. And part of the reason that I didn't like doing it as well as I thought I would is because that damn sound of chalk on board, that's real presence. You gotta be there to feel the chalk, to smell the chalk, to hear it scratch against the slate. That for Lacan is a real element to every Borromean knot. It's an image drawn on the board with one's hand. You see where he's going with this? And there, I think we have it. Or I should say we have them. Imaginary, real, and symbolic all at once. Lacan is clear on this point. The Borromean knot, he says, is imaginable since I made an effective image of it. Symbolic because I define it as a knot. And altogether real by the very happening of this saying. It's from page 83 of our readings. I am not just making this shit up. Note where Lacan goes from here onto page 84 of our text. Note how he develops this thought on the following page. And again, I quote, "The consistency of all of that, of course, is only imaginary, except that we reduplicate it with the symbolic, simply by imagining it as a knot. And what is it to imagine it on the one hand, but on the other to formulate it as a knot? It pushes us toward mathematical formulas," he says, "the elaboration of which in writings and sayings alike, on the blackboard and in the seminar room, requires what Lacan calls, and page 84 is the magic number for this, real presence." But let's just hold up for a second. We talked about the imaginary. We talked about the symbolic. You got a bit of the real, however naive, on the table here. What's all this bit about mathematical formulas? Mathematical formulas of what? What's he talking about here? These are mathematical formulas of the very thing we've been talking about. Not so much good love, but the relation of truth qua unconscious knowledge to the real. Here figured in the impossibility of a sexual relationship. Truth's relationship to the real is something that Lacan has had rattling around his brain since L'Étourdi. That's why in L'Étourdi, in our series on L'Étourdi, we really focused in on that move of his to characterize truth as the real's little sister and the real as truth's sensei. Recall those passages. That's about where he really starts doing this work of teasing the true and the real apart to show that they're different. He is still working in that direction. That's why love is such a key topic for him, because it puts us on the path towards an understanding of the difference between the true and the real. How, in God's name, does the Borromean not help with all of this? How does it push us towards mathematical formulas of truth's relation to the real? That is the question here. Do not get it twisted. Lacan begins to get after it, it seems to me, at the end of chapter 5 in Seminar 21, when he asks, what happens if we turn his drawing of this Borromean knot over? What happens if we flip this thing over, he asks. Meet me on page 103 of our packet. And if you don't have it in front of you, don't trip. As always, I'll read the key passages for you. So what's happening here on page 103 is he's ramping up to a drawing of the Borromean knot. And he wants to ask about it as an image that could perhaps be flipped over. Check this out. What is to be said of it from the moment when, having flattened it out, I turn it over? There must be, by the simple fact, linked to the fact that the writing implies that the overcrossing, the croisement supérieur, should be written in this way, namely that it cuts what is the undercrossing, the croisement par en dessous. Sorry about the French, y'all, but it's here in the English translation, which is nice, so I read it for you. What is that going to give if we turn it over? What was not underneath comes to the top. And that's a really key thing. If you take an image of the Borromean knot and you turn it over and you flip that image, something you can really only do in the imaginary, what was not underneath it comes on top, Lacan says. By turning over the knot, the Borromean knot, what you are going to find when all is said and done is something which is distinguished by the fact that it is not its mirror image. Far from it. When you turn over the Borromean knot, you have a completely different aspect, which in no case represents the mirror image of the first aspect. You see what he's asking about? So if you draw the Borromean knot and then you try and flip it over, what you get is not a mirror image. There are things that weren't underneath the first drawing that now are visible. That's interesting. And the second drawing, which is a flip side of the first, doesn't line up with the first any longer. This is kind of what he's working at. We'll draw it in a second to clarify all this. So just hang tight. Remember, we're going slow in the direction of this topological work. So, in that spirit, let's start with the first weird business in the passage you just heard. What's all this talk about overcrossing and undercrossing? That's our first question, which in turn brings us to the second. Why, when you flip over Lacan's drawing of the knot, does what was not underneath come to the top? Which in turn begs a third question. A crucial question. Why is Lacan emphasizing the complete difference between these two sides of what is ostensibly, apparently, imaginarily the same knot? Once more, we are moving slow and steady. We'll take these questions one at a time. When you draw a Borromean knot, you see a series of overcrossings where certain rings overlap with others, creating an overpass of sorts. So let's just go ahead and do one of these. I'll choose some different colors for us to work with, but we are now going to draw a Borromean knot. I'll start with the color red. The way we like to do this first is you draw one circle. Call this your first stroke. And then what we want to do is we want to show somehow that it is overlaying another circle. So we draw the other circle, but in such a way that shows the first one we drew to be overlaying it. Do you see that? And notice, in order to draw the second circle, I had to make two strokes. In order for the second circle to appear underneath the first, I had to draw it in two segments so that I would not break the red line on the board. And then, of course, we add our third element. And I'll go with a color that I think kind of pops well with this. We'll use orange. In order for these two overlapping rings to hang together, a third ring is needed that goes over the red, but under the white, over the red again, but under the white, and then links up. Check it out. On your screen right now is a Borromean link, a Borromean knot, and it took me 6 strokes to get it done. But here you have it. This is a Borromean knot. When you draw one of these, what you see is a series of overcrossings where certain rings overlap others. This creates an overpass of sorts. So in the image on your screen, do you see where orange passes over red? It does twice. Orange passes over red twice. And in that moment, orange is an overlay, which creates an overpass, and red becomes an underlay, which creates an underpass. So do you see what we're doing here? You can ask a similar question about the white. The white circle marks an overpass for the orange. It goes over the orange, which creates the image of an underpass at the level of the orange circle. Similarly, the red circle, the first one we drew, is actually an overlayment in this drawing of the white, which creates an overpass that is red and an underpass that is white, at least imaginarily. This is what he's doing with overpass and underpass here. Check it out. With every overpass comes an underpass, an undercrossing, as Lacan describes them. Technically speaking, there's really nothing new here. If you think about this, if you really recall where we are, isn't this the very same topology that we scaled up in our series on Seminar 11 when discussing Lacan's use of that inner eight, that interior eight? Do you remember the work we were doing there? I'll draw it down here so you can see the thing. And I'll just draw it hastily, just because I imagine just seeing this alone may cause you to pee your pants a little bit, but it may also arouse you a bit, and it may actually trigger something else entirely. This is the interior eight. So if you're new to all this stuff, imagine that this little inner circle, this inner loop, was just flipped up, and now you would have a regular image of the number 8. The inner 8 is just when you take the top loop in the number or the figure 8, and you fold it in so that it is now included in the bottom ring that creates the number 8. But the way that this works, the reason why this matters, is that in order to draw this thing, I started at 6 o'clock. And then at around 12 o'clock, I created an overpass that then looped around to establish an underpass of sorts. And I'm overdrawing the orange so that you can see kind of how this thing works. This is exactly how we were using the inner 8 in our series on Seminar 11, just following Lacan's lead here. The creation of an overpass establishes a certain underpass. An overcrossing comes with an undercrossing. And the question then is, what conceptually can we do with this? Imagine you're in a helicopter and you're looking down at a series of freeway intersections, interchanges. It's an urban environment, and all the freeways in your city are coming together in a series of loops and squiggles and curves and off-ramps and on-ramps. You know the image I'm talking about. You're in a helicopter looking down at this complex interchange of freeways, where one highway crosses another by way of a bridge, while another crosses it by passing underneath the bridge, perhaps even through a tunnel of sorts. Here's the thing. From above, in your helicopter, you can see all of the freeway that passes by way of bridge, but you can only see 2 segments of the freeway that passes underneath it, perhaps by way of tunnel. It's a visual segmentation of the second freeway established by the bridge across which Freeway 1 travels unbroken. What I'm asking you is underneath the bridge. It's imaginable, but it is fundamentally unknown. You can imagine that Freeway 2 does indeed cross underneath Freeway 1. You can't see its continuation from the helicopter, but you imagine that it does because you see a red car go in that tunnel and a red car come out the other end, and for lots of other reasons too. It's imaginable that the road continues, but you really don't fucking know. It is unknown what is happening underneath that bridge. This is why bridges are always popping up in folk tales, because you just never know what's happening underneath there. Here, in this image, we have a vision of the relationship between speech and truth, symptomatic statement and unconscious knowledge, and a relation that functions nodally. Lacan's not making a big fuss about this yet, but it is starting to pop up in Seminar 21. I don't know if he's going to do anything with it, but it is important to note here. The logic here is a nodal logic, a series of links or overlaps. It's a nodal meeting point that you see where the bridge goes over Highway 2. The consistency that we imagine when we look at Borromean knots like the one on your screen, inner eights like the one on your screen, freeway intersections like the one on your mind's screen. The consistency we imagine when we look at these images, it belies a certain ignorance, a certain blind spot, a certain inconsistency, and with it a certain way of knowing that we call unconscious. That's what's happening in the underpass imagined by the appearance of an overpass in these drawings. We imagine there's something underneath these overlayments, but in fact, there's nothing there. It's an image of nodality and nothing more. To properly draw a Borromean knot is to provide viewers with the illusion of three-dimensionality. Focus on that Borromean knot I just drew. Do you see it? It's a three-dimensional illusion. It's an illusion of continuous, unbroken rings overlaying each other. But in fact, when we draw one of these Borromean knots like I just did on the screen in front of you, it's literally to write not a single unbroken ring. When this thing is done, what's been written is a series of broken rings. And if I was really clever and a better drawer, I would have done the red just as I did the orange and the white rings by actually inserting cuts. But it's okay. It's okay to draw it as we have right now. In fact, it's what allows us to keep our count right. So, when we draw this thing, and we note the 6 moves that it takes to do it, this, I think, is what you see. Which brings us back to pages 103 to 104, where Lacan asks this wild-ass question: what happens when we flip that shit over? What happens when you flip the Borromean knot on the board in front of you right now over? I'll spell it out first, and then we'll do the flip, and you'll see what I mean. First and foremost, in order to flip this Borromean knot over, you have to draw another Borromean knot. In order to provide the viewer with the flip side image of the knot on your screen right now, we're going to have to draw another one. You have to first draw another Borromean knot, and with it another illusion of consistency, an illusion of 3 consistent rings hanging together in a knot of consistency. Second, in order to flip this Borromean knot over, you have to draw what was not underneath the first knot, of which this one, the one we're about to draw, will be the flip side. And third, you have to create another series of overpasses and underpasses in this flip side drawing. Let me show you how these three things occur when we produce the flip side of this. So I'm going to start by drawing the white circle, just as we started by drawing the red last time. Notice we're flipping this thing, so now the left-hand side of the diagram has the white circle, which means that the right-hand side of the diagram is going to have the red circle. And because I want to provide the illusion of the white circle being overlaid onto the red, I draw it as follows. Do you see? Now, instead of red being atop white, we see white atop red. Orange also has to do some different work here. Orange has to come in and link white to red. The logic is the same, but the drawing is different. Orange comes in and overlays white, underlays red, overlays white, underlays red, and then comes back around to itself. What you now see on your screen are two Borromean knots. They are flip sides. The second one, the one I just drew, is the flip side of the first. Lacan is asking, what do you see if you imagine flipping the first one over? This is what you see. We're doing the work of flipping this thing over. Now, what do you see when you flip this thing over? The three elements that I just described. First and foremost, you see another Borromean knot. That's what you see right next to the one we drew. Second, you now draw what was not underneath the first knot, of which this new one is the flip side. What was not underneath the first knot is now popping up as though it were. Fascinating. We'll come to that in a second. And third, lastly, you have to create a new series of overpasses and underpasses. Now orange goes over white. And now white is the underpass relative to orange, you see? Now orange goes under red, and red is the overpass that constitutes orange as an imaginary underpass. When you flip them, you create a whole new series of freeway interchanges. All right, let's see what this does for us. What I'm trying to say is that when you flip a Borromean knot over on the board, you're basically right back where you started, with an illusion of consistency belying a certain unconscious inconsistency. And this, I think, brings us to the key point. These two drawings of what we imagine to be the same knot, a knot which is itself propped up by three imaginary rings which are no such thing in the drawing itself because each is in fact broken. These two drawings, they are not mirror images of each other. Instead, they're completely fucking different. What's overlaid in one is not what's overlaid in the other. What's unconscious in one is not what is unconscious in the other. Only in the imaginary do we assume ourselves to be dealing with the same knot. Only in the imaginary can we assume either drawing to be a knot in the first place. And only in the imaginary can we assume the constitutive elements of either to be unbroken rings. At the level of the symbolic, where presence and absence figure grandly, this spell cast by the imaginary begins to break. Overpass, underpass, conscious knowledge, unconscious knowledge. The logic here is thoroughly symbolic and downright linguistic. Where then does the real come in? Exactly where you'd expect it to. In each and every figure of breakage, rupture, and irremediable division that you see on the screen in each of these drawings. At the level of each imaginary ring, you see breakage. At the level of each imaginary knot, you see breakage. And crucially, because we are still talking about love, at the level of the complete difference between these two imaginary knots comprised of imaginary rings, imaginary knots comprised of imaginary rings that are you and me. In the impossible symmetry, indeed the non-rapport between these two knots that are you and me, the truth of each, hidden in an underpass which doesn't exist, reveals itself to be on the edge of an irremediable difference that gives the lie to every illusion of consistency here, and thus allows us to touch upon the real. So what, my friends, are these mathematical formulas that Lacan was talking about in chapter 4, the ones conditioned by these illusions of consistency we were reading about? They are the very mathematical formulas that you see on the screen right now. The Borromean knot, it turns out, is not just an image defined as a knot. It is also the writing of a certain mathematical formula, a formula whose mathematical presentation is neither linguistic, nor alphabetic, nor even numerical, nor even variable, but instead topological. Do you see the move that you can trace on your screen right now? We're not dealing with signifiers. We're not dealing with letters. We started by dealing with variables, numbers that aren't numerical, letters flipped backwards, X's that were variables for which to solve. And where we are ending, where we have trended, is even in the direction of a writing that dispenses with the variable, that dispenses even with non-alphabetic letters. The love letters written on the board in these Borromean links and these Borromean knots, they are still mathematical, they are still formulaic. They are formulations, though, at the level of topology. The Borromean knot is a mathematical formula written without number, letter, signifier, or the like. It is truly at the level of the stroke, and the stroke alone, that this thing functions as a mathematical formula. Each a pile of strokes. So, we started this with a little stumble into the world of the self, into questions about what the self is. And I can't help but want to ask the question, how do you write split subjectivity? If that /s doesn't quite get us there, how are we to write split subjectivity? Why, in terms of speaking being, Lacan would answer, yeah, okay, but how to write speaking being, I would want to know. Topologically, Lacan would reply, and in triplicate. What then does this make us, you and me alike, in love and otherwise? What does this make us as split subjects effected by speaking being and formulated in terms of a Borromean knot? Here, at the end of this lecture, and I'm tempted to just end here, Lacan has got the riff. This is the riff of riffs in Seminar 21. I love what he does with this. We are, as Lacan puts it on page 114, patients of triplicity. Now, like I said, I'm tempted to just push stop right here, if only to give all of us, myself included, a chance to sit with this figure of the classic Lacanian subject, neurotic through and through, as a patient of triplicity. Unfortunately, We got one more little road to travel before we sleep. And I think it's an important one. I think it's important to add one more thing before we part paths. It's a thing that we define as the one. As we've learned so far in Seminar 21, non-dupes believe oneness with themselves, oneness with others, and hell, oneness with the cosmos are all possible. Good dupes, on the other hand, perhaps even good dupes with access to good love, they realize oneness with self, oneness with other, and oneness with cosmos to be impossible. Why? Because they accept that we're all, to some extent, dupes of the real, even and especially when we imagine oneness as reality. And this, above all else, is Lacan's point in the first half of Seminar 21. In order for non-dupes to fantasize about oneness with themselves, others, and the motherfucking cosmos, they must also be dupes, indeed patients, of triplicity. A triplicity whose mathematical formulation is at root topological, specifically Borromean. One more passage to tell you what I mean, and then we're out. What I am trying to do this year with my non-dupes is to see what one must, in short, be a dupe of for all of that to hold together, and for it to hold together in a consistency. And that is why I am introducing this ternary. The ternary known as the Borromean knot. To be drawn to these images of consistency, call them intrapersonal, call them interpersonal, call them extrapersonal. To be drawn to images of consistency is to have an eye for something of the one, Yadlin. And to mistake illusions of oneness for signs of unmediated, uncut, pure reality is to fail to see that we're always already living lives of three, which is to say, lives in multiplicity, which is to say, lives defined by inconsistency. Inconsistency to the point of irremediable difference, by which, of course, I mean impossibility. Yet another reason, maybe even the best, to end this lecture with the Borromean knot, instead of its triplicitous patience, or at least the images of the Borromean knot on the screen before you. For it's here, at the level of these images, and no deeper, that we can begin to see something of the impossible by way of something of the one.